This week we'll be talking about the body, specifically addressing biocultural perspectives on health and illness. So we'll start by asking ourselves, what do we mean, or how do biological and cultural factors shape our bodily experiences? When we think about health, development, etc., we often think that things are pretty hardwired. This claim that things are hardwired, though, ignores some crucial biocultural variation. So remember that when we talk about biocultural influences or factors over health, we're talking about this intersection of biology, psychology, and culture. And specifically, the fact that our mind is so adaptive and plastic points to a very significant role that culture will play in at least our psychology, if not overall, like our patterns of growth and development. So, this view that biology is responsible for a single human nature has been deeply entrenched in American culture. There are some universal aspects to human nature, but these are, even though they're universal, they're still very plastic or malleable. So, one of the characteristics that is a human universal is the fact that when mothers speak to infants, they do so in a sing-song voice. We call that motherese. So it's like, instead of telling a child, wow, look at you, you're getting so big, you'd be like, oh my goodness, look at you, you're getting so big, right? You hear that different kind of lyrical note in the voice. And this is hardwired and very specific to what babies cue into as their brains are beginning to develop, particularly between birth and 6 months. So, hardwired trait, but what's malleable about it? Well, it doesn't matter what language you speak, right? When you look at mothers cross culturally, you find that in their languages, they use that sing song voice when they're talking to babies. Another human universal is the ability to use mental maps, but what you map is going to be culturally specific, right? So, if you guys are from Albuquerque, you're probably pretty familiar with the streets of Albuquerque. You could probably even take that familiarity and go to an unfamiliar city and read a map and figure out where you are. What you might have more trouble with, though, is if we plop you down in the middle of the tropical rainforest, right? However, the Ache in Paraguay are very, very familiar with their areas of tropical rainforest, and they can highlight and pick up on um, natural features that, even if they're in an unfamiliar section of forest, allow them to navigate. They would struggle a lot more if we were to plop them down in the middle of Asuncion, one of the cities. So, one assumption is that biology is destiny, which may only be minimally modified by culture throughout the course of a human life. Well, our brains are born incredibly immature, only about 25% of adult brain size. And so, very critically, one of the things that's going to be very molded by culture, by nutrition, by experiences, is going to be our neurological physiology, our brain physiology. So, our brain architecture. So, it's naive for us to think that biology is destiny. So, this assumption has been challenged by decades of cognitive research, research that indicates that our brains are continually influenced by cognition and by bioculturally variable phenomena that depend on our cultural environments. From birth to age 5, your brain is undergoing most of its growth. It lays down more neural synapses than it's going to need as in an adult brain. It's going to lay down synapses to deal with all of the cultural experiences that you have by the age of 5. So if that's going to be 3 different languages, you're going to have those synapses laid down for understanding and being able to speak 3 different languages. During adolescence, your brain is pruned based on the neural connections that you use the most. And then your brain has the myelin sheath laid down on that. Neural connections that you don't use get fine tuned, get cut out. Neural connections that you do use get reinforced. So, if during the rest of your childhood and your teen years you're continually speaking 3 languages, guess what? Your brain's going to be fluent in 3 languages. So there are a lot of things, a lot of ways in which, and a lot of our life course over which our brain is constantly being fine tuned. So when it comes to human behavior, culture matters. We may have some basic evolutionarily inherited tendencies, but the way that those get expressed are going to be very culturally significant. Our brains, particularly during the first 5 years of life, develop in the context of a particular culture, a particular language, and a set of social relationships and norms. We call this flexibility neuroplasticity. Okay, we've got neuroplasticity, we've got developmental plasticity, we have extreme levels of behavioral plasticity, which shows us that we are able to internalize the culture that we're exposed to and then make valid decisions based on the rules and norms of that particular culture. We can acquire new skills like reading, writing, using mobile devices. These are recently acquired skills that were unnecessary for most of our evolutionary past, right? Think about the ease with which people pick up tablets, smartphones, and computers, right? Young people gravitate towards them. Babies can navigate them. I mean, I watched my own kids, and yeah, the American Academy of Pediatrics says no screens before 2 years of age, and we tried to minimize that. But the reality is, if you've been sitting at the MVD for like 3 hours already, and you've got an 18-month-old that's incredibly fussy, right? You're going to pull out something to keep them entertained. And at that point, you might even pull out something that entertains them with a relatively minimal effort on your part. So babies can easily pick up how to swipe, how to touch, how to navigate between things. And how well do your grandparents or your great grandparents use computers? Right before my grandmother died, I mean, she'd send me an email about once a week that was filled with chain letters and like precious moments images that talked about how much she loved me. So, it was like her use of the computer, what she tried to tackle in the computer that was very important to her that she have a computer, she wasn't using it to the fullest of its capabilities. She was using it to send email and pay a few bills online, right? So as we get older, we are perhaps less adept at picking up some of those new skills with technology, but what it's doing is it's wiring our brains in fundamentally different ways. Okay, so there is no way, no how that our brains today are like our brains were 20,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, a million years ago, right? Because the technology that we're exposed to, the culture that we're exposed to is incredibly different. We take things like two-dimensional media, like this slide, for granted, but people who were raised in environments without such stimuli have to actually learn to interpret information that is presented in two-dimensional representations. So what comes so naturally for us is really a struggle for a whole lot of people. We've got language having its root at least probably a million years ago, if not 2 million years ago, with Homo erectus, right? And language is one of those things that kids actually like, really, because it's been so important in human culture for so long, so important in our evolutionary history, kids naturally pick up language. But reading is not the same. Written script has only been around for about 6,000 years. And so we spend literally from pre-K or preschool all the way up until about third grade mastering how to read. It's not something that comes easy to all kids. It's not something that most people just pick up in a day or so. It takes lots and lots of practice to form the cognition associated with reading. So, we learn things that have been characteristic solutions to adaptive problems for a long time very easily. We learn things that are new solutions to things with varying degrees of ease, depending on when it's introduced into our lives. So if it's introduced when we're infants, we learn it easier than if we're trying to tackle it as adults or elderly individuals. So these and other cultural differences in perception suggest that mental development varies with cultural practices. What happens is those cultural practices fill in our direct knowledge, or fill in the gaps in our direct knowledge, to create the meaning for those specific ideas. So we have a human tendency towards religiosity, filling in spiritual or supernatural beings to explain things that we don't understand, to explain some of the big kind of philosophical questions of where did we come from, where are we going, right? But the nature in which those spiritual beings are represented is going to be very dependent on your specific cultural practices. So the meaning of that spirituality is going to differ if you are an indigenous foraging group versus growing up mainstream desert Southwest Roman Catholic. So our mind processes information and constructs cognition models. These cognition models provide this framework. These cognition models help us interpret other people's actions, help us to create the meaning in our lives. The brain is also part of our nervous system. We have a complex neurological network that reads and regulates chemical and biological conditions throughout the body. The whole nervous system is impacted by culturally conditioned mental stresses. So this can affect things like blood pressure, immunity to disease, and levels of fatigue. We're walking around with constant rates of inflammation. Is that inflammation the same that we see in other societies? And why does it lead to such a high rate of heart disease in our society? There was a really interesting kind of after effect or outcome of a long lasting health and wellness project that's been done with the Shamane of Bolivia. And it was led initially by Hillard Kaplan at the University of New Mexico. Hilly has gone on and moved to a college in Southern California. And then Mike Gervin, who was a former student of Hilly's, who is at UC Santa Barbara. And one of the questions they wanted to answer was, is inflammation really the reason for high rates of heart disease in modern human populations? You know, why don't we see like hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists dying of heart attacks? And so one of the kind of stabs they took at answering this question was looking at overall levels of inflammation. The Shamane have incredibly high levels of inflammation, as high as ours, if not sometimes even higher. Theirs comes from a different source, though. Theirs comes from parasite load. And interestingly, theirs doesn't lead to heart disease. So inflammation alone is not a valid explanation for the high rates of heart disease that modern Americans experience. So, you know, we see different physiological responses. We see different disease risks, right? When you look at populations like many of the Native American populations in Canada and the United States, their health and wellness evolved in tandem with a very specific diet that was very different from what we're eating today. Agriculture, innovated about 12,000 years ago, has led to massive rates of things like heart attacks and even cavities. We didn't really have cavities as hunter-gatherers unless we ended up like chipping a tooth and exposing the root therein. So the health and wellness of these native populations is very context specific, very diet specific. When they are transitioned to what we call the standard American diet, which correspondingly, if we look at the abbreviation for that, it's SAD, it's a SAD diet. Kind of tongue in cheek, but not really, right? I'm going to choke myself on my tongue instead. They have poor health outcomes. They have high rates of diabetes. They have high rates of heart disease. So, you know, we have not just our nervous system, but really our entire physiology that, particularly if we follow traditional diets, are very context specific. Think about things that cause you stress, right? Think about things that you think of as psychological or psychiatric disorders. Biology and culture interact, combine to affect our physical health. These factors make us rethink our assumptions about individual minds and how we can better understand the psychology of culturally diverse people. People think about the world in different ways. That is very culturally specific. So we can't swoop in with our kind of colonist mentality and expect people to hold dear the same things that we hold dear, expect people to be very profit driven when their community has been collective, expect people to really see the same issues as problems when they were just fine with the way things were. Culture impacts our mental health. There is a relatively young field, ethnopsychology. These are anthropologists who analyze world psychologies. They explore how societies make sense of persons, of selves, and emotions. Ethnopsychology indicates that the experience of emotional disturbances and even mental illnesses may produce different reactions and behaviors depending on the cultural context. And so mental illness certainly has biological dimensions, brain chemistry, even brain architecture for something. So I'll talk about myself here for a minute, just to give an illustration. I have Tourette syndrome. And as a comorbidity with Tourette syndrome, I also have obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so um, my Tourette's is certainly biologically based. There's not a whole lot. I mean, Tourette's has definitely got a genetic pathway. It's been identified. It's actually a dominant genetic pathway. And it's tied to sex chromosomes at least a little, in that males are much, much more likely to exhibit Tourette syndrome than females are. There are some forms of Tourette syndrome, though, that are triggered by something called PANDAS, which is a pediatric acquired autoimmune immunodeficiency syndrome, where because of a strep infection that moved into the brain, kids will end up waking up like one morning all of a sudden with some sort of psychiatric illness. It could be Tourette syndrome, it could be OCD, it could be bipolar. So even for something that's as clearly genetic as Tourette syndrome, there's kind of like well, a little twist that comes from the environment. Um, I've got a friend from grad school, Paul Andrews, who works with the evolutionary basis for depression and anxiety. And he proposes that depression and anxiety are adaptive. That is, that they give you an evolutionary benefit when you're living in kind of a traditional, small scale, everybody connected to everybody, socially connected environments. And what they serve to do, I mean, anxiety certainly serves to warn you about dangers. So you're anxious about uh, venomous snakes or spiders, right? That is an adaptive fear. That is an adaptive anxiety. You're anxious about getting into a car. Well, that might be adaptive too. Think about people who develop kind of a fear or panic about automobile traffic after they've been involved in some horrific accident, right? Um, they've seen firsthand how you might be injured or die in a car accident. It can make sense not to want to drive. Um, the idea of depression is that it signals to others that you're in need of investment. And in a very tightly linked, socially connected population, that generally results in people reaching out to you, bringing you food, sitting with you, giving you physical attention like hugs and stuff, things that have measurable therapeutic benefit. In our disconnected, almost anonymous world, right, what does that turn into? That turns into you isolating yourself, canceling plans with friends, sleeping a lot, maybe either eating too much or eating too little. We've lost that social connectedness. And so something that could be adaptive in a more traditional context becomes incredibly maladaptive, and we resort to psychiatric meds. So just interesting ways in which we've got culturally different views on mental illness. You don't hear foragers talking about high rates of depression and anxiety. That's something that's associated with the disconnect of our modern world. You also see people with neurodivergent characteristics being appreciated in different ways. Um, Touretters, for example, filling kind of a shamanistic role because their tics mimic or allow them to trance more deeply. Think about schizophrenia, where people hear voices, right? In a right kind of ethno religious context, that could be someone who's viewed as having a gift to commune with the spirit. So, even with something like mental health disorders, we've got to recognize that there's culturally specific components that both lead to the cause of, um, as well as how much we medicalize them, right? How much we try to quote unquote fix them versus finding a society or gearing society to be able to accept and appreciate neurodivergent people. So psychological abnormality is culturally interpreted because the difference between normal and abnormal is based on socially accepted norms. Mental illnesses are also unique to culture. There's a condition in East and Southeast Asia called Koro, in which a person believes that his or her sorry, that should be his or her, not his or her genitalia and nipples are shrinking and even disappearing. This is not a syndrome that we have much experience with in the United States or in the Western world. So this is a culturally specific, called what we call a culture-bound syndrome. American psychiatrists classified homosexuality as a mental illness until 1974. It could be cited as justification for denying immigration into the US until 1990. We no longer define sexual orientation as a disorder or an acceptable basis for discrimination. In the past 5 years, we've seen a growth in trans rights, right? Whereas there are many cultures that have celebrated gender nonconforming individuals for millennia. So we've got very specific cultural factors that define what qualifies as a mental health disorder or a mental illness. Some people actually propose culturally specific treatments, or societies may actually propose culturally specific treatments for mental illness. I can say that working with the local chapter of the Tourette Syndrome Association, we had certain protocol we had to have in place before we could work with education on the syndrome with Native American populations. We had to meet with boards of native healers, the elders of populations, before we could come in and give educational in-services and such on recognizing Tourette syndrome in children. In Bali, healers identify specific causes of madness. Those causes of madness may include spirits, deceased ancestors, or the blessings or curses of gods. And so healing is tied up in religious expression as well. We talked about, when we were talking about the adaptive strategies, we talked about this spirit possession among Malaysian microprocessing plants, where you bring in a shaman to conduct sacrifices to be able to clear away the spirits that take the form of were-tigers. Depression, anorexia, and post-traumatic stress disorder are now diagnosed in places where they were not recognized to occur before. Is that an effect of just simply better diagnosis, right? We have this same question being asked about the rates of autism in our country, right? Autism is increasing. Many people say that this is simply because we are better at recognizing individuals who fall somewhere on the spectrum. But there is also evidence that the incidence of autism is also increasing. So that then brings in some cultural and or environmental components that brings about the expression of autism. And autism has a very strong genetic pathway, but also then is modulated by environmental exposures. So, interesting kind of interplay between biology and culture when it comes to recognizing particular disorders. Western treatments and cultural assumptions can destabilize indigenous treatment options. Our way of dealing with it is not better than particular context-specific indigenous ways of dealing with disease. In fact, you think about yoga, right? When we think of yoga, we think of it as a fitness regimen. We think of it as something that, I don't know, more hippie-loving Hollywood people engage in yoga practices. It might be seen as a way of de-stressing, maybe seen as a form of exercise, etc. But yoga has thousands of years of cultural specific association with particular postures being treatments for particular maladies. So you would go to a healer in Hinduism, and they would prescribe specific yoga poses to get at the root of what's causing your complaints. Western co option of that separates out that healing nature that religious practices in the form of yoga poses may allow for. So, our first thinking critically about the body. If individual psychology differs from one culture to another, what might this suggest about the academic and clinical disciplines of psychology in which most psychologists treat patients who are Americans? Right? Have our definitions of psychology and psychiatry been specifically focused on our interpretation of neurology, neurochemistry, and behavior? Right? Are we diagnosing and treating maladies in ways that um, really don't work? Yes, absolutely we are. Conversion therapy was one of those, right? With a long history, 20 to 30 years of um, trying to convert individuals who are homosexual. There are still religious groups in the US engaging in conversion therapy. So, just something to keep in mind. And what might these psychologists consider when dealing with recent immigrants from Africa or Asia, right? Particularly when it ties to religious ethnomedicine. So, we got to recognize as people move around the world, as we have a growing what we call diaspora, populations of people that are multi-sited, um, located even on different continents, then we've got to recognize their cultural reality, their cultural history when even diagnosing and treating illness.